January 6, 1944. Headquarters of the 8th Air Force, High WWII, England. Major General Jimmy Doolittle was standing in the commander of the 8th Fighter Command's office, Major General William Keeptainer, when he noticed something on the wall. Above Keeptainer's desk, a placard with a straightforward message was conspicuously displayed. Retrieving the bombers alive is the 8th Air Force fighter's primary responsibility. Before turning to Keeptainer, Doolittle read it twice. "That sign must be taken down," he stated. Silently, "It's incorrect. A new sign took its place in a few hours. The destruction of German fighters is the 8th Air Force fighter's primary responsibility. One of the most important tactical choices made during World War II would occur at this precise moment. A radical change in fighter doctrine that would destroy the Luftwaffe in a matter of weeks. The strategic genius that gained air superiority over Europe would turn out to be what the bomber crews initially referred to as suicide and what some commanders deemed foolhardy, the mathematical aspect of aerial. One general's readiness to forego doctrine in favor of outcomes was going to change combat, not just via technological advancement. For months, the crisis had been intensifying. Deep in Germany's interior, 291 American B-17 bombers conducted the second raid on Schweinfurt on October 14, 1943. Crucial ball-bearing plants that generated parts necessary for German war manufacturing were the target. After arriving at the target, the Americans dropped their explosives with deadly precision. However, the price was disastrous. 60 bombers did not come back. 17 more were irreparably ruined. In one afternoon, 600 soldiers were killed or reported missing. Due to the odds against them, American bomber crews were statistically unlikely to complete the mandatory 25 mission service. Survival rates dropped to between 25 and 35% during the harshest of 1942 and 1943. One of the few crews to finish their tour, Lieutenant Robert Morgan, pilot of the renowned Memphis Belle, wrote in his diary that evening, "We are being slaughtered. At the German border, the fighters turn back, and we continue to fly into hell by ourselves. The force defend themselves. Well, but it's insufficient. Either the fighters must accompany us all the way, or we must cease operations." The techniques that the German fighters had devised were incredibly effective. After forming up outside of the Allied escort fighters' range, they would launch a mass attack. American gunners had only seconds to respond when bomber formations were passed head-on and closing speeds surpassed 600 miles per hour. With just one strike, fighters armed with 30mm cannons and air-to-air rockets might destroy a B-17. It was an easy problem. The range of American escort fighters P-38S and P-47 Thunderbolts was insufficient to follow bombers to far-off targets. The escorts had retreated 300 meters from the target over Schweinfurt. Fighting for their life against German fighters who might attack, without warning, the bombers persisted on their own. In December 1943, U.S. Army Air Forces commanding General Henry Arnold issued an ultimatum. The planned assault on Normandy cannot happen unless Operation Overlord destroys the German Air Force. Such losses are unsustainable for American bombers. The strategic bombing campaign will terminate if you can't find a solution. In November 1943, a sleek silver fighter that would revolutionize everything arrived as the answer. The P-51 Mustang in North America, which is propelled by at war emergency power, Packard's Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, which produced 1695 horsepower, had capabilities that looked nearly unattainable. The Mustang could accompany bombers 1,600 meters to any location in Germany and back with drop tanks. It was faster than any German fighter, cruising at 437 miles per hour. The Mustang's two-stage supercharged Merlin engine performed exceptionally well at altitude, where the thin air presented difficulties for other engines. The combatant was able to fight successfully at heights where Mess and Wolves found it difficult, reaching 41,000 feet. In his battle report, Captain Chuck Jerger, who flew P-51s with the 357 Fighter Group, detailed the impact of the aircraft. The P-51 climbs better, turns tighter, and is quicker than anything the Germans have. For the first time, we have an aircraft that can go. When we arrive, the bombers fight wherever they go. Everything is altered by this. However, having the range to accompany bombers to their objective was just half the answer. Success or failure would depend on how well those escorts were used tactically. Fighters flew in close formation around bomber streams while maintaining constant sight of their charges under the prior doctrine. American escorts would engage German fighters in combat if they launched an attack, but only to repel them before resuming close formation. Defensive protection was always the top priority. A deadly dynamic was produced by this defensive stance. The location and timing of the strike were up to the German pilots. They swarmed to the bomber formation at full speed, massed beyond sight, range caused damage before fleeing before American combatants could mount a successful retaliation. Though they never took it, the bodyguards responded to German initiative. This defensive strategy was established by the departing commander of the 8th Air Force, Major General Ira Eaker, as a former bomber pilot. Eaker sincerely thought that the bombers' machine guns overlapping fields of fire would be enough to defend them. The purpose of fighters was to enhance, not to replace, that protection. Jimmy Doolittle had a different perspective on the matter. A bomber was not Doolittle. Pilot. He had an MIT doctorate in aviation engineering and was a fighter pilot, test pilot, and racing champion. Few people had the same understanding of aircraft performance as he had. Above all, he was aware of tactical dynamics. The April 18, 1942, attack on Tokyo by 16B, 25 bombers from a carrier Hornet, which made Doolittle famous, was a daring, technically challenging, and strategically smart operation. For personally spearheading that operation, Doolittle was awarded the Medal of Honor. He now oversaw the 8th Air Force, which General Arnold had given him the task of resolving the fighter issue. January 6, 1944, his first full day in command, Doolittle met with General Keep Tainer and gave his order of revolution. It was no longer acceptable for fighters to remain defensively near bombers. Rather, they would actively seek German fighters by flying up to 50 miles ahead of the bomber stream and 25 miles on either side. American fighters refused to accompany bombers home once they had finished their attacks. Rather, they would move at low altitude over Germany, bombing trains and fuel depots, damaging aircraft on the ground, and strafing airfields. The Luftwaffe was to be totally destroyed, not merely to keep bombers safe. American fighter pilots were frightened and surprised by the directive crews of bombers. Commander of the famed 4th Fighter Group, Colonel Donald Blakesley, knew instantly. He said, "This is what we have been asking for." To his commanders, the ability to hunt. "We no longer act as shepherds watching over sheep. We're wolves." However, the viewpoint of the bomber crew was captured by Lieutenant Colonel Jim Howard, the 354th Fighter Group's operations officer. The liberators and guys flying forts believe we are deserting them. They consider it insane when fighters abandon them to seek Germans elsewhere. They fail to realize that it is preferable to kill German fighters before they reach the bombers. Protection as opposed to destroying them following an attack. The crew of the aircraft had legitimate concerns. Only because fighters remained near, chasing attackers away, had they survived missions. Bombers would now appear helpless, as those fighters vanished over the horizon. Many crews thought Doolittle's order, which was drafted by a commander who was ignorant of their battle, was a death sentence. The German response to the novel American strategies would either support or refute Doolittle's risk. The winter from 1943 to 1944, Luftwaffe appeared to be on the verge of winning the air war. In fact, German fighter production had grown in spite of 3 years of Allied bombing. Every month, more than 1,000 fighters were provided by Messerschmitt and Fowler-Wolf factories. German pilots had created strategies that worked well against American formations. Bombers might be destroyed in a single attack run by the heavily equipped Sturbach-Volkhoff 190 fighters with powerful guns in underwing pods. Faster Mess 109 fighters escorted them, and their duty was to restrain American escorts while the Sturmker slaughtered the bombers. German Fighter Force Commander Major General Adolf Galland thought the Luftwaffe was winning the battle of attrition. He reported in November 1943 to Hermann Goering, Reichsmarshal, said the American bomber losses could not be sustained. "The Americans will have to stop daytime bombing by spring if we keep up this pressure," he wrote. However, There was a deadly blind spot in Gallen's study. He ignored pilot attrition in favor of aircraft production figures. Germany was producing fighters in factories and on the ground more quickly than the Allies could kill them. However, Germany was unable to replace seasoned pilots at the rate at which they were losing their lives in battle. Nearly 3,000 fighter pilots were killed, injured, or reported missing by the Luftwaffe in 1943. In order to fulfill demand, new pilots' training period was reduced from 250 hours to 150 hours. When they entered combat, new German pilots were seldom skilled enough to fly their aircraft, let alone fight effectively against experienced American aviators. Bielefeld in January 1944, Hans Dammers, an 8 Victory Mess's 109 pilot, wrote to his brother outlining the issue. Before they are murdered, the novice pilots may survive 3 or even 4 missions. They're not skilled at dogfighting. They are unable to collaborate with their wingmen. When attacked, they freeze. In addition to battling the Americans, we veterans must defend them. It's getting impossible. The test of Doolittle's new strategies was postponed due to the early 1944 weather. Bombers were grounded for days during winter storms. However, the new American fighter tactics made their premiere on January 29th, when more than 800 bombers launched against Frankfurt. At 28,000 feet, P-51 Mustangs from the 357 Fighter Group flew in loose formations as they blasted ahead of the bombers' streamed improved visibility and response time. They weren't connected to any particular bomber boxes. They hunted wherever German fighters might show up instead. The American fighters saw a group of 50 Mess's 109s ascending to intercept the bombers close to Bonn. The Mustangs attacked the Germans without waiting for them to do so. The Germans, who had anticipated attacking bombers whenever they wanted, were unexpectedly forced to defend themselves against combatants who were faster and had an edge in altitude. The battle went on for 8 minutes. 13 German combatants were killed. Despite their damage, both Mustangs made it back to base. After dispersing, the remaining German formation never made it to bombers. Captain Don Blakesley, who led the 4-jet group on a similar operation that day, described the impact of the new tactics. Over Cologne, we saw 20 Falk wolves gathering. They climbed to attack the bombers while moving slowly and carrying a lot of gasoline and ammo. We had altitude, speed, and surprise. It was a massacre. Before the others could flee, we annihilated 11. You in a war like this. Something noteworthy was observed by the bomber crews that day as they flew over Frankfurt. German fighter attacks, which often started a long way from the objective and persisted all the way through the bomb run, hardly happened. The enormous formations that had decimated other raids never materialized, though there were a few scattered strikes. They had been intercepted first by the new fighter tactics. The real test, however, was Operation Argument, often referred to as Big Week, which took place in February 1944. The plan was created as bait by General Karl Spaatz, who oversaw the U.S. strategic air forces in Europe. The Luftwaffe would have no option but to defend German aircraft factories with all of their resources when American bombers targeted them. Although it would be helpful, destroying the factories was not the main objective. The intention was to compel the Luftwaffe to final attrition war against American combatants who now outnumbered, outpaced, and outfought their German rivals. February 20th, 1944. For the first time in weeks, there are clear skies over Germany. With the help of hundreds of fighters, more than 1,000 American bombers from England and Italy attacked 12 distinct aircraft manufacturing plants. The biggest air fleet ever built in a single day. As soon as the American formation passed overhead, Major Erich Hartmann, Germany's top ace with 352 victories, realized what was going on. He informed his squadron that this was not a bombing raid. Bombers are being used as an excuse in this fighter battle. They desire that we have no choice but to stand up and fight. In response, the Luftwaffe used every resource at its disposal. More than 900 German combatants rushed to stop the American formations. The biggest air combat in history broke out in the sky above central Germany. At elevations ranging from sea level to 40,000 feet, the contrails of thousands of airplanes intersected. However, American combatants were not defensively attached to bomber formations this time. They attacked German fighters wherever they came across them, spanning hundreds of miles of German airspace. On the ground, launching, assembling, and moving toward the bombers. The Thunderbolts and Mustangs pursued relentlessly. Lieutenant Urban Drew of the 361st Fighter Group spotted a squadron of Messerschmitt 262 planes, Germany's groundbreaking new fighter, taking off from an airstrip close to Leipzig. Once airborne, the jets were swift and lethal, but during takeoff, they were weak. Screaming through flak, Drew launched himself from 30,000 feet and fired on the lead plane as it took off. The aircraft burst into flames. Before a second jet could accelerate, he destroyed it. The other jet broke apart. Drew became famous for his combat report. The jets are dangerous in the air, but they must take off and land like any aircraft. Catch them there, and they burn like any other. The Americans lost 4 fighters and 21 bombers on the opening day of Big Week. This was a miracle by Schweinfurt standards 3 months prior. However, the Germans suffered devastating casualties. More than 50 fighters were destroyed. More importantly, 38 pilots were killed or gravely injured. The raids persisted for the next 5 days, whenever the weather allowed. Regensburg, Brunswick, Schweinfurt once more, Gotha, and Augsburg were all hit by American bombers. Hundreds of warplanes and bombers arrived with each raid. The Luftwaffe had to react to every raid. Germany lost pilots and fighters in every operation that it was unable to replace. In his journal, German ace Major Heinz Baer, who had over 220 wins, detailed the impossibility of the situation. We fire down bombers, but the fighters are everywhere. We form up, and they attack us before we can attack. We land too. They strafe the airfield and refuel. They wait as we take off. There isn't any way out. 2 fighters and pilots are lost for each bomber we destroy. By the end of Huge Week on February 25th, the numbers spoke for themselves. America loses. About 2,600 people were killed, along with 226 heavy bombers and 28 escort fighters. Within a month, American production and training made up for these significant losses. German losses. More than 350 combatants were killed, and another 90 were irreparably disabled. Even worse, the Luftwaffe lost more than 50 pilots who were gravely injured and around 100 pilots who were killed. On average, these pilots had been in battle for more than 3 years. They couldn't be replaced. In his report to Galland, Lieutenant Colonel Herbert Ellerfeld, who commanded a fighter wing of Jagdgeschwader, wrote, "The most seasoned men are leaving us. The American fighters are too strong for the novice pilots to survive. We will have planes in 3 months, but nobody will be able to pilot them in combat." However, Doolittle's plan went beyond aerial battle. His directive second phase, which involved strafing attacks against German infrastructure and airfields, was just as disastrous. American fighters would descend to low altitude and strike targets of opportunity throughout Germany each day after returning from escort flights. Damage to airfields was very severe. Hangars, fuel trucks, fighters parked in the open, and aircraft undergoing maintenance were among the targets. German pilots reported returning from combat to find their home airfields under attack, forcing them to land in the midst of strafing runs or divert to other locations. Major Gunther R., a 275 victory Luftwaffe ace, explained the psychological toll. "On our own airfields, we used to feel secure. There is nowhere safe. Morning, noon, and evening are when the Americans assault. Pilots die on the ground after surviving combat. When repairing airplanes, mechanics are killed. Fuel trucks blow up. Under continual attack, we are unable to continue operations." The cumulative impact first appeared in the 8th Air Force conducted its first significant raids on Berlin in March 1944. The German capital was hit on March 6 by 730 bombers, accompanied by 800 fighters. Due to Berlin's strategic and symbolic significance, the Luftwaffe had to react as forcefully as could. They did. The American forces were confronted by more than 150 German combatants. As fighters engaged in combat and bombers advanced on their targets, the ensuing conflict raged for hundreds of miles. By the end of it, the Americans had lost 11 fighters and 69 bombers. 160 German aircraft were destroyed, while another 50 were damaged. The number of pilots killed was astounding. Almost in one day, 70 seasoned fighter pilots were killed or injured. It was a catastrophe from which the Luftwaffe could never recover. The leader of the first group, Jagdgeschwader 52, Captain Johannes Wiese, survived the combat on March 6th and wrote that evening, "I witnessed the death of the German fighter arm today. Even though we threw everything at them, it wasn't enough. We couldn't shoot them down as quickly as they fired us down. Their losses are short-term. Ours are unchangeable. We have lost the war." The Luftwaffe could no longer withstand the cumulative attrition between January and May 1944. More than 1,000 German fighter pilots were killed, injured, or reported missing. More than 1,000 men lost their lives, were injured, or went missing. This accounted for around 25% of all fighter pilots that were available at the beginning of the time. More importantly, the most seasoned pilots suffered the most losses. The instructors, squadron and group commanders, veterans, and troops with hundreds or perhaps thousands of victories were all methodically murdered. Because they led from the front and attempted to shield the less seasoned rivals, they were the most aggressive and ultimately died. Between January and May, 28 German aces with more than 30 kills perished. 8 aces with more than 100 kills were either slain or taken prisoner. These men each symbolized years of fighting experience and training. Literally, none of them could be replaced. The pipeline for training was unable to keep up. By mid-year, Germany had reduced training time to just 110 hours of total flight experience, with some late-war pilots obtaining as low as 50 hours, while graduating 29,000 new fighter pilots in 1944. During that time, American pilots trained for more than 450 hours, 250 of which were spent in combat planes. Before being killed in battle in October 1943, German ace Major Hans Philipp, who had 206 victories, wrote a last letter home outlining the new pilot scenario. When the boys arrive at the squadron, they are unable to fly formation properly. They are not aware of tactical fundamentals. When they are fired upon, they panic. They may survive 1 or 2 missions before dying in combat against skilled American pilots operating better planes. We are unable to instruct them quickly enough. There isn't any time. Another aspect of the narrative was revealed by the difference in aircraft production. Over 22,000 fighter aircraft were built by American companies in the first half of 1944. 9,000 fighters were built by German factories in spite of scattered attempts to avoid bombing. The qualitative edge made the difference crucial, even though the numerical advantage was overwhelming on its own. The P-51 Mustang was simply superior to Messerschmitt 109 and Foucault 190 in most combat scenarios. It was quicker, more maneuverable, had a greater range, and performed better at high altitudes. The combined effect was seen by Colonel Hubert Ska, who commanded the 56th Fighter Group, which flew P-47 Thunderbolts. We have more fighters, better fighters, pilots with more training, better tactics, and an endless supply of ammo and gasoline. The Germans have courageous soldiers piloting excellent airplanes that they are unable to maintain or supply. Such a deficit cannot be permanently overcome by courage. The transition was finished by April 1944. In terms of pilots and operational aircraft, German fighter strength had dropped to less than 60% of January levels. More importantly, the quality of the force had declined. Disastrously, there were no longer any veteran formations that had brutally attacked bombers in October 1943. Inexperienced pilots operating aircraft with inadequate fuel, ammunition, and upkeep made up the majority of the new Luftwaffe. With every mission, they encountered American formations that grew bigger and more assured. The 8th Air Force sent out about 900 bombers on May 8, 1944, to target marshalling yards and oil refineries throughout Germany. They were joined by more than 750 escort fighters. No German combatant arose to intercept. For the first time, the Luftwaffe gave up the sky without a struggle. On that day, General Galland reported to Goering, "The combatant force is destroyed. Due to a shortage of gasoline, we are unable to operate our aircraft. Although we have pilots, the majority are ineffective fighters. The Americans strike whenever they want. We are no longer able to dispute their improved air quality. The strategic significance became evident on D-Day, June 6, 1944. On the first day of the invasion, the Allied air forces conducted more than 14,000 sorties. Less than 300 sorties were flown by Luftwaffe fighters. The difference made it possible for bombers to isolate the battlefield, while Allied ground assault planes destroyed German defenses. On June 10th, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who was in charge of German forces in France, sent his wife an urgent telegram. The enemy's air advantage is absolute. Our troops cannot move in daylight without being attacked. Our supplies cannot get to the front. We can't hold the invasion beaches without air cover. The change between October 1943 and June 1944 was astounding. The Luftwaffe had appeared capable of killing the American bomber offensive 6 months prior. They were no longer a viable combatant force in Western Europe. Systematic destruction is depicted in the statistics from those pivotal 6 months. The Luftwaffe lost more than 2,500 fighter pilots killed or gravely injured in battle over the Reich between January and June 1944. At the beginning of the period, this accounted for almost 75% of the fighter pilot force that was available. American defeats in the same period totaled approximately 420 fighter pilots killed or missing, and 7,000 members of the bomber crew were killed, injured, or taken prisoner. Although significant, these losses were manageable considering American aircraft manufacturing and training capabilities. The kill ratios were entirely inverted. American bombers were being destroyed by German fighters at a rate of 20 per German fighter lost in October 1943. By May 1944, the ratio of American fighters to German fighters was 4-1. Beyond the figures, however, the psychological change was just as thorough. German pilots, who had gone into 1944 with the expectation of winning, now flew missions with the expectation of dying. German fighters were now actively pursued by American pilots, who had previously feared them. Don Gentile, the 4th Fighter Group's captain who had about 20 aerial victories at the end of the war, explained the shift. We were relieved that the Germans did not attack in January. We were let down when they fled in March. We were angry by May since there weren't many people remaining to fight. The change was complete. Doolittle's wager was justified by the success of his plan, but also produced an intriguing historical irony. The bombing campaign had been rescued by his choice, which many bomber commanders immediately criticized as irresponsible desertion. Aggressive fighter tactics were more protective since they destroyed German fighters before they could assault bombers. Never could defensive escorts be. In an evaluation conducted in June 1944, General Spart acknowledged this. The key to gaining air superiority was General Doolittle's choice to release the fighters. In just 4 months, we destroyed more German fighters than we had in the 2 years prior. The secret was to let combatants hunt instead of making them defend. Ecker's successor as Chief of Bomber Operations, Major General Frederick Anderson, acknowledged that his early resistance had been incorrect. I thought the only way to keep fighters safe was to keep them close to bombers. I was mistaken. Murdering enemy combatants prior to it is much more effective to attack them than to kill them while attacking. This was understood by General Doolittle. No, I didn't. Beyond doctrine, the tactical revolution radically altered the conception of air warfare. Escort fighters were considered an addition to bomber defensive armament prior to Dittle's January instruction. Following the major week, it was believed that fighters were the main tool for achieving air superiority, with bombers acting in part as bait to entice opposing fighters into combat. For many years, Air Force doctrine would be shaped by this notion. Every combat that followed, including the Korean and Vietnam Wars, would use the lessons learned in early 1944. Although the strategy's human cost was high, air superiority is achieved by proactively eliminating enemy fighters rather than reactively defending friendly aircraft. In the first half of 1944, more than 10,000 American airmen lost their lives while flying over Europe. The bomber aircrew showed incredible bravery by flying missions day after day, knowing that each sortie might be their last. Amazing skill and aggression were displayed by the fighter pilots who agreed to hunt German fighters deep over enemy territory. The 56 Fighter Group's Lieutenant Robert Johnson, who lived to become with 27 wins over the course of years, He was the second highest scoring American ace in Europe. We discussed numbers, tactics, and strategies, but in reality, thousands of young men boarded planes every day and entered conflict knowing that many would not return. Because of our greater bravery, skill, superior planes, superior tactics, and superior leadership, we prevailed. Jimmy Doolittle realized that defending bombers meant destroying fighters, not lingering near bombers, which is why we prevailed. By August 1944, the Luftwaffe fighter force was almost no longer a unified defensive unit. Individual teams continued their heroic and occasionally successful efforts. The Mesed 262 was a new jet aircraft with revolutionary potential. However, it was impossible to undo the pilot force's systematic devastation in the first half of the year. In 1944, Germany produced more than 36,000 fighters, the most during the war. However, there wasn't enough time to restore what had been lost, not enough skilled pilots to operate them, not enough fuel to train the pilots that were there, and not enough seasoned leaders to create winning strategies. The situation was summed up by Captain Erich Rudolfer, one of the few German aces to escape the war with more than 220 wins. By the end of 1944, we had a large number of airplanes. We possessed planes and other modern fighters, but no skilled pilots to operate them. All of the skilled pilots had been killed by the Americans in the spring. By the time our output peaked, the war was already lost. The success of Doolittle's plan set a pattern for contemporary air combat that remains relevant today. It is impossible to gain air superiority through defense. It calls for vigorous offensive action against enemy facilities and aircraft. A technological edge is crucial. The caliber of training is crucial. The importance of numerical supremacy only becomes apparent when combined with quality superiority. Most significantly, leadership that is prepared to question accepted wisdom and take calculated risks can achieve strategic outcomes that much outweigh little adjustments to current practices. Doolittle's choice to alter Captainer's wall sign was more than just a token gesture. It signified a significant rethinking of the way that fighters are employed. Initially fearing Doolittle's tactics as abandonment, the bomber crews eventually realized and respect the approach. In June 1944, Stars and Stripes reporter Andy Rooney, a technical sergeant who flew bombing missions to chronicle the air combat, observed, "The fighter pilots saved us by leaving us." Although it may seem counterintuitive, this is true. Despite their proximity, the Germans launched an attack. The Germans were unable to get to us as they hunted and flew ahead. A strong offense was the greatest defense. This was understood by General Doolittle. We didn't. He was correct. The Allied air forces had established total air superiority over Western Europe by the time of the Normandy invasion. German aircraft continued to fly, but they were so few and ineffective that they were unable to seriously challenge Allied air power. The invasion was successful in large measure because soldiers may engage in combat without worrying about opposing airstrikes. In his post-invasion assessment, Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight Eisenhower accepted this. "We got the one thing we needed to succeed from the air forces. They allowed us to function freely, without impediment from hostile planes. When destruction was necessary, General Doolittle's fighter tactics annihilated the Luftwaffe. This will go down in history as one of the war's pivotal campaigns." Among the most striking reversals in military history was a change from October 1943 to June 1944. The Luftwaffe was taking first place in the attrition war over Germany. Losses of American bombers could not be sustained. It appeared that the strategic bombing effort would fail. The Luftwaffe broke 6 months later. Under total air cover, Allied ground forces readied themselves to invade France while American bombers flew with few casualties. German commanders found it difficult to understand what had transpired because the transformation was so abrupt and thorough. In his wartime memoirs, General Gallen pinpointed the exact turning point. The Americans prevailed in the air war after they modified their fighter tactics in January 1944. American bombers may be fought by us. We were unable to combat their fighters and bombers at the same time. We were doomed as soon as they let the fighters loose to pursue us. The conclusion was only a question of time. The campaign's final numbers show how overwhelmingly successful it was. The Luftwaffe lost more than 4,000 fighter pilots to combat over the Reich between January and December 1944. In air combat and on the ground, American and British fighters destroyed more than 11,000 German fighters. By late 1944, German fighter pilot training had decreased from 200 hours in 1943 to less than 100 hours. In the same time frame, the United States lost roughly 16,000 members of the bomber crew and 750 fighter pilots. Despite these substantial losses, more than 35,000 new pilots were graduated from American aviation schools in 1944, and American factories produced over 63,000 military aircraft. The kill ratio in air combat. A decisive shift occurred. About 1.2 kills for every loss had been accomplished by Luftwaffe fighters in 1943. The ratio flipped in 1944, with American combatants scoring 3.7 kills for every defeat. The ratio surpassed 7 to 1 by 1945. However, pilot experience levels were possibly the most telling data. The typical German fighter pilot had more than 200 hours of combat experience in January 1944. The average had dropped to less than 50 hours by January 1945. Despite the limited number of planes and fuel, the Luftwaffe had not ran out of either. Its supply of skilled pilots who could fight successfully has ran out. Doolittle's contentious choice had succeeded in just what General Arnold ordered. Prior to the invasion by Normandy, it rendered the Luftwaffe an ineffective fighting force. It proved that aggressive offensive fighter tactics outperformed defensive escort tactics in terms of effectiveness. It demonstrated that eliminating enemy combatants was necessary to achieve air superiority rather than just defending friendly bombers. There was a huge human cost. During World War II, more than 26,000 American pilots lost their lives while flying over Europe. In the Pacific, more people died than the U.S. Marine Corps as a whole. More than 47,000 people were killed in the 8th Air Force alone. These men's bravery, talent, and selflessness allowed them to attain air superiority. The campaign was disastrous for the German fighter pilots. Numerous young men, many of whom were still in their teens, entered cockpits, aware that they would not survive. They bravely and expertly battled against insurmountable odds until they were taken by death. Almost all of the squadron leaders, veterans, and aces were captured or killed in battle. Few people made it through the battle. The only reason Major Eric Hartmann, who led the war in ace counts with 352 victories, survived was because he fought mostly on the Eastern Front. He recognized what had transpired in the West following the war. In 1944, the Luftwaffe was destroyed by the Americans over Germany. They had more and better planes, pilots with more training and better strategies. Despite our valiant efforts, we were defeated. General Doolittle had a really clever plan. We lost everything as a result. Many thought Doolittle was insane when he ordered the sign in Keeptaner's office to be altered in January 1944. By June was acknowledged as a genius. Destroying enemy fighters was, in fact, the first responsibility of fighters. That principle led to everything else. American fighters had methodically destroyed the Luftwaffe in 4 months of intense warfare, which made it feasible for the Berlin raids, the destruction of German infrastructure, and the defense of ground forces during the invasion. The only way to win turned out to be what had appeared to be irresponsible. When military historians examine the air campaign over Europe 7 decades later, Doolittle's January instruction is often cited as the pivotal moment. One decision, one change in tactics, won. The air battle was dramatically changed by the general's readiness to question doctrine. Fighters killed German fighters before they could attack, which is why the bombers made a safe return, not because they remained nearby. The paradoxical idea that offensive action offers superior defense than defensive stance was codified into philosophy. The lesson was learned by air forces all over the world. Instead of reactively defending friendly aircraft, air control is achieved by aggressively eliminating enemy aircraft. During the war, Lieutenant General James Doolittle commanded the 8th, 15th, and 12th Air Forces before retiring from the Air Force in 1946. He was showered with decorations. He has the Medal of Honor, several medals for meritorious service, and a British honorary knighthood. However, He regarded the fighter directive as his most important choice out of all of his accomplishments. In an interview from the 1970s, Doolittle thought back on that January day. The most difficult choice I had to make was to alter the fighter tactics. Bomber commanders were against it. It was feared by bomber crews. A few fighter pilots believed it to be suicide. However, I understood from my own fighter piloting expertise that air fights are won by aggressive action. You can't win by playing defense. Attacking is how you win. Although the losses were awful, they would have been even worse if defensive strategies had been used. Because we took a chance and launched a fierce attack, we prevailed. The sign that Doolittle had ordered taken down from Keep Tanner's Wall in January 1944 is now housed in the U.S. Air Force's National Museum in Dayton, Ohio. It has a replacement sign hanging next to it. When taken as a whole, they describe a tactical shift that led to European air superiority. Many of the bomber crews that made it through the war attributed their survival to Doolittle's choice. At first, they had rejected the shift because they thought it was abandonment when fighters left them to pursue Germans elsewhere. They learned differently from experience. Destroying enemy fighters before they could attack was the best defense for bombers. Doolittle's order marked the beginning of the end for the Luftwaffe. When October 1943 rolled around, they were winning the attrition-based air battle. After 6 months, they were no longer a viable force. American technological dominance, training excellence, aggressive tactics, and numerical superiority all combined to produce overwhelming results. The January-June 1944 campaign serves as an example of military ideas that are still relevant today. When the capabilities of the two sides are about equal, offensive action wins out. Even when outnumbered, superior training yields superior outcomes. Decisive dominance is achieved by combining tactical innovation with technological advantage. Strategic outcomes are attained by leadership that is prepared to question doctrine and take calculated risks. Most significantly, though, achieving air superiority necessitates eliminating enemy fighters rather than defending friendly aircraft. This paradoxical reality realized by Doolittle and validated in action over Germany in 1944 continues to serve as a cornerstone of air warfare doctrine across the globe. In the end, the tale of how a general is directed to alter a wall sign caused the Luftwaffe to be destroyed in a matter of weeks is about comprehending the basic principles of air combat. Doolittle realized that the main objective of fighters, which are offensive weapons, is to eliminate other fighters. Their potential is wasted, and initiative is given to the opponent when they are used defensively. His techniques were first dreaded by the bomber crews, but they eventually saw their wisdom. It was too late for the German pilots who resisted those methods to realize their effectiveness. Additionally, military aviation gained knowledge lessons that would influence future generations of air combatants. Doolittle's plan was fully successful on June 6, 1944, as Allied soldiers crowded the Normandy beaches in clean skies devoid of German planes. There was no sign of the Luftwaffe, which had plagued Europe for 5 years, annihilated air armies from Poland to France, and pounded London into rubble. They had been hunted to extinction by American and British combatants. What years of bombing could not accomplish was accomplished by a single tactical choice, a single doctrinal shift, and a single general's daring to question received wisdom. The Luftwaffe was destroyed by attacking fighters rather than factories, by hunting hard, not by protecting bombers, not by taking offensive while playing defense. January 6, 1944, was the day the sign was taken down. After 6 months, the Luftwaffe was completed. There is no denying the clear, quantifiable, and obvious link between those two occurrences. In just a few weeks, one general's rash tactics had decimated the enemy air force, established air superiority over Europe, and guaranteed the success of the invasion that would free the continent. Jimmy Doolittle's choice to alter fighter tactics is regarded by history as one of the most important leadership choices made during World War II. It was essentially correct, not because it was intricate or technically advanced. Combatants' primary responsibility is to eliminate other combatants.